Welcome to the EFC webinar on palliative care in Canada. My name is Karen Stiller from Faith Today magazine. We have two palliative care experts with us today. Rauni Salminen is CEO of the Philip Aziz Centre for Hospice Care in Toronto, and Emily House. She is also an ordained Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada pastor. We're also joined by Dr. Julia Lee, a family physician who has practiced palliative care and teaches at the University of Toronto and McMaster. She also studies theology part-time. Welcome, Rauni and Julia.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Before we begin, I want to remind viewers who are participating in the webinar that you can send in questions anytime through the chat function on your screen, and we really welcome those questions. These webinars are all about sharing information and learning together, so please feel free to do that. So I'd like to start at the very beginning, because I think there may be some confusion or uncertainty about what palliative care is. So let's define our terms. And Julia, would you take that first? What do we mean when we say palliative care?
Well, I mean, palliative care is really end-of-life care. I mean, when people think of it, they think about the medical care that's involved in end-of-life, but it's not only that. It actually is ideally supposed to encompass emotional, spiritual, mental, all of the health and well-being in totality for people, and not just for individuals, but for them and their families and communities as people transition into dying. Ideally, how that works out practically is often different, but palliative care is that totality of the whole person and who they are in context of their families and communities as they transition into death.
And Rauni, do you have anything to add to that definition?
I think I can add to a little bit later some of the questions that you're asking, but it truly is, I agree, it's about relieving suffering, and that suffering can take the form of physical, spiritual, psychosocial. It's also ensuring that family members and caregivers are supported right through to bereavement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so when would it typically begin in the journey? Like I'm diagnosed with an illness that I know is going to lead to my death. Like when would palliative care kick in typically, Julia?
In a perfect world,
yes.
as soon as as soon as the diagnosis is made.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I mean, I think we have a lot of issues in the West around kind of we see a diagnosis as something scary, which is true, and we get so consumed with the doing treatment, doing these things, doing the hospital and medical care things that sometimes it's at the neglect of all those other aspects of what makes us human. And then when things get to the point where there is no further curative treatment available, and people kind of get passed on to the palliative care team, it's often a shock to a lot of people. Like they feel like it's an abandonment, or it's the end of the road, or there's nothing else to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a little bit of a problem in terms of that transition between what some people would consider active medical care and palliative care, when in fact they should really be on a continuum and be running in parallel at all times. It's just a bit of a problem in terms of how we understand and still very much fear death, and so get very worried when palliative care kind of gets involved.
Yeah, as soon as I hear the term palliative care, like if there's someone we know, pardon me, know, and my husband says, oh, so-and-so is now in palliative care, my immediate impression is their days are numbered. We're nearing the end. That's it. Is that right?
I would say so. I mean, that's still very much the common understanding of things. Partly it has to do with funding, partly it has to do with our cultural attitudes, partly it has to do with a whole bunch of personal and individual factors in terms of accepting what end of life means, and it also kind of has to do with the medical system in terms of feeling like they've failed someone if they can't cure them, right? So there's a lot of cultural factors as well as healthcare system factors that come into play, but that is still very much the common understanding, right?
Okay, Rauni, you are running a hospice care center. At what point in this journey are you receiving people into your what you offer there?
Once they're referred to us, and I agree that often people are referred to us too late, and we throw all kinds of services at people near the end of life that they could have benefited from right at the beginning of their diagnosis. And we prefer to get people earlier on in the trajectory so that we can start putting services in slowly, because still at that point, there's services like psychosocial, spiritual support, as we mentioned, pain being managed, making sure caregivers aren't burning out. So if you throw those in the last 2 weeks of life, the person's pretty overwhelmed with all these new services. So having them introduced earlier on, and that team introduced earlier on, it's like I have friends who are physicians who often say there that there's nothing more we can do for you, team, which means the GP says, there's nothing more we can do for you now, you're palliative. Well, a palliative physician would say there's so much more we can still do for you. There's still life, there's still, quality of life, and making sure you live life to the fullest to the end.
Yeah, that term, there's nothing more we can do for you. Maybe we need to get rid of that term, Julia.
Yeah.
It's rather dire. So we've sort of talked a little bit about what palliative care is, and maybe we've touched on this, but what misconceptions are out there, do you think? I mean, I think one that I have is that it's terrifying and it's horribly sad. And can you talk about that? How do we think wrongly about palliative care? Rauni, do you want to start with that?
I think I go back to saying that there's nothing more that we can do for you. We often say that we can't add days to a person's life, but we can help add life to their days. And I think the misconception also, going back, agreeing with the doctor, is culturally, we celebrate life and people are around you when you're born and there's parties, everybody's so excited. Well, somebody should also be there when you're dying and support you and celebrate the days that you do have, or months or weeks that you have, but to take advantage of every single day and live it to the fullest. I mean, the one thing about palliative care opposed to sudden death is in palliative care, you get to plan. You get to right wrongs. You get to perhaps even do some things on the bucket list that you've had on the bucket list. You get to look at those existential issues perhaps that, have plagued you or haunted you, whatever, and make things right, sort of vertical and horizontally.
Okay. Let me ask you, you said that lovely phrase about adding life to the days. Tell us how you literally do that. What happens? How are you adding life to their days?
We, in hospice care, for example, it's everything from being able to allow caregivers a break from caregiving. It's being able to take that person out if they can't go out on their own anymore, but they can actually still feel a little bit like they've got some control. You go to the grocery store with them, you do banking with them, you can do some writing of journals with them, you can do some legacy work with them. We can bring in a music therapist, we can bring in an art therapist, we can bring in a chaplain and spiritual care provider that actually will work on some anticipatory grief issues with them and with loved ones. So there is a lot hospice can still help support in that period of time.
Okay. Julia, to go back to the question I just asked about misconceptions, is there anything you want to add to that as a physician? How are you helping people think differently about this?
Well, I think one thing, like as you've alluded to, is that a lot of people think palliative care means you're pretty much at the end of the road, which is true to a certain extent. But a lot of people also think that palliative care means that it actually will hasten your death because you're not getting any active treatment anymore. And I'm putting that in air quotes. But in reality, people who do get early palliative care intervention and do opt for kind of a more palliative way of treatment, in fact, tend to have longer lifespans, longer survival times than people who go through aggressive and sometimes experimental and sometimes very risky treatments that don't necessarily help lengthen their days at all, and in fact may give them so many side effects that they usually often wish that they hadn't gone through it at all. So that's certainly one myth, that palliative care will actually shorten your life, when the evidence seems to show it actually will increase both the quantity and the quality of the time that you have left.
And why the increase in quantity? Is that because you're in a better place psychologically and emotionally, or?
I think if those pieces are in place, then yes. And I think also there's a huge there's a huge appeal to being able to be free in many ways from being shackled to the hospital for treatments,
Okay.
and spending time recuperating from those treatments, and as well as because palliative care does focus on symptoms in terms of how you're feeling
Mm.
rather than what your disease is doing. And if we can make you feel better from the things that are actually making you feel unwell, then that helps people actually be able to be more fully engaged in the living that they have to do.
Mhm.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I'm left kind of thinking, who wouldn't want that?
Yeah.
But we know access is an issue in Canada. So, and a report just came out that said 89% of Canadians could benefit from palliative care, but only 15% of people who died in 2016, 2017 received publicly funded palliative home care. Can you speak to us about that? That maybe it's kind of a political issue, I guess, is it? Or is it an act of the
It's
will?
partly political, it's partly, the way the healthcare system's designed, it's partly, how physicians practice. I mean, there's some of those very real factors. I mean, Rauni and I are based in Toronto, and so we have access to services that people in other jurisdictions, especially rural and remote areas of the country, don't. Toronto is very lucky in that sense, but that's because we're a very large urban center. So there's certainly discrepancy in that. Yeah, I don't know, Ronnie, if you want to add anything more to that.
Yeah, I would say one of the things, Julie, you said was about doctors, that feeling of giving up. And I think that's part of it too, is referring clients or their patients early enough. It does seem to them that somehow it's a failure. And we see a lot of that in pediatrics. We just want to continue to treat to fix, to cure, to fix, to cure. Um, but Julia is also right. It is very political. It's an issue of funding. It's an issue still of education and awareness. It's still advanced care planning is a huge push. I mean, there's so many things that come into play, but a lot of it is, are we referring, are people educated on what palliative care is? Doctors being able to refer, any sort of health agencies being able to refer people to palliative care in a timely manner. And it's coordination in the system. The system is not well coordinated. It's better coordinated in Toronto because there's so many services, but even there, it kind of depends on what entry point you enter the system and who you get as to what services that you're going to be referred to.
I think I probably also need to throw in I think the issue of MAID, medical assistance in dying, is also complicating the landscape a little bit, particularly for physicians of faith,
Mm.
of all faiths, not just Christian faith, in terms of how we navigate that. So I think there probably will be some issues around just human resource as well, especially as in
Mhm.
Ontario, it's particularly complicated for physicians. So there's that too, which is
Yeah.
I'm just
Ab-
being that's true. So.
yeah, absolutely. And as people of faith who are engaged in this type of work, are you concerned that the emergence of medical assisted dying in Canada is going to just take away even more resources or attention from palliative care? Julia?
That's an interesting question. I, I think it will, for people of all faiths who feel that medical assistance in dying is contrary to those moral values. I think it will discourage younger students, like younger physicians, to consider palliative care because they are worried in terms of how it may ask them to compromise their moral ideas. Um, and it's hard to say, as the government is still kind of tracking how things are going, and we're still relatively early days. It's only two years and
Mhm.
4 months since the legislation came into play, and I think we're still not really quite sure where this landscape is going to end up. Um, yeah, but it is changing, certainly, the environment of how people understand death, and how we approach death. And also it is kind of changing how palliative care providers are being seen in that role, particularly physicians. Yeah.
Rauni, before we go too much further down, talking about some of the other things we should speak about, help us understand exactly what hospice is. And I understand it as, and I'm probably wrong, being part of palliative care, like it's like one expression of it. Is that true? Or what does hospice do?
There's two types of hospice. One is visiting hospice programs. And so, for example, Philip Aziz Centre, we have about 350 to 400 volunteers who go through a 30-hour standardized volunteer training. So they don't provide medical support, but they provide complementary supports to the medical team. So that would be giving a caregiver a break. So you haven't been out for 3 weeks to get your hair done because your partner's too sick, you don't want to leave your partner alone. A volunteer can go in for up to 4 hours a day and even up to 7 days a week, depending how much support that family needs. So we work hand in hand with community care access centers, which are now called home and community care. They've changed their name. Who provide the nurses and who provide the physicians. So we're part of the palliative care team. That's visiting hospice. We talk about also having hospice trained volunteers in long-term care facilities and in hospitals. So they should have that extra hands and feet to support them. As far as residential hospice, it's a home-like environment where people can go and live out their last days, where a family can be together. It's far away from the bells and whistles and codes and beeps and bangs of a hospital and people come in and out of your door. It's a very quiet, home-like environment that supports the entire family.
Okay. And here's a complete question out of total ignorance. Do families have to pay for that?
They're both free.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So I would like to ask you both. Well, I'll give you background. First of all, we launched a palliative care toolkit. The Evangelical Fellowship of Canada did, and to kind of generate some conversation around that, we threw it out into the social media world. Send us your palliative care stories if you've been involved in a palliative care setting. And I felt like it was actually a bit of a risky thing we were doing because I thought, what if no one, you throw a party and no one shows up? That's what I was afraid no one would respond. But actually, we were amazed at how many stories we received of just ordinary Canadians who were touched and by the palliative care experience they had had. So I wanted to know if you both could share a time where you were particularly touched or especially convinced of the power of palliative care because of just being part of that journey as somebody died. Julia, you probably have lots of stories like that.
Oh, I mean, I think every patient, I think it's always been very touching to me in terms of having the privilege to actually be in someone's home and involved with their families and being able to help them. Not just the individual, but their families to kind of help teach and explain kind of what is happening and what to anticipate and how to walk through that. Like to companion with them has always been really really a privilege. I mean, I think some, again, when I talked about people who actually, the evidence seems to show that people actually last longer than we'd anticipate them to. I mean, some of my patients, I mean, they lasted, gosh, they were given only like 2 months to live, and yet then I got to follow them along for like 12 or 14 months, like far longer than
Wow.
even I was expecting, delightedly so, that they and so could participate longer with them and their families and hear their stories, and especially since we are of the generation of a lot of them, some even still who, World War II, even before that, lived through the Great Depression, and just being able to kind of hear stories of how Toronto was back in the 30s and 40s and what they remember is really quite something, like, and witnessing all the different generations of family who come and be part of all that, if just for a little while, is really always very, very powerful.
Julie, it sounds like you, like as a physician, when you're doing palliative care, you must really be slowing down.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic. Honestly, it's the way medicine should be, right? In terms
Yeah.
of getting to know who people are and know their stories and know their families, and and part of it is to be able for them to be able to leave a piece of their legacies you know, and even though I'm really peripheral and really at the very end, but to still be part of their legacy that way, that they could leave some of those memories behind for me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Rauni, how about you? You must have walked with many people over the years.
I was thinking about this morning, and one that came right to mind was at Emily's house, where we support children who are seriously ill through respite and through symptom management and through palliative care. We had a little guy that came in. He was about 2 months old, and his parents brought him here from the hospital, from sick kids, and they wanted to all just be together. And Emily's house provides that home-like environment where family can have kitchen and they can sleep in the same room with their child, and it's very comfortable for them, and it is quiet. But we also have a lot of recreation activity, music played for the kids and for the siblings as well. So this little guy came in, and we had a birthday party. That was a parent's wish, that they wanted to have a birthday party for him with his other little brother that was very healthy, that they could have birthday party together. So we arranged this huge party for them. And the other wish the family dad had, is that he can go to one Toronto Maple Leaf game with his son. Well, it ended up that we were able to get that day tickets to a Toronto and Ottawa game. And he was able to take his son and his wife and a couple of the family members. And there they were at the Leaf game. And the little guy was wearing a little Toronto Maple Leaf jersey. Mom and dad were wearing a jersey. And he died a couple of days later. But the family just said how they felt so hugged during probably the most difficult time of their life. But also how they felt that having that legacy. I mean, we do a lot of legacy work with families. We even do a little silver, you do a pink, you do an imprint of the finger, and then we make that onto like a charm, a silver charm that goes around the neck. They said having those days with their child and making those memories, Julia talked about memories and legacy, was just so important, and to have it in a safe, comfortable space.
Okay, I'm going to ask the question that I think every mother at least is asking in their mind right now listening to you, is like, how do you do this work? How do you go home at the end of the day not incredibly sad?
I go back to somebody has to do this work. I mean, if there was a cure for everything, we wouldn't have to do this work. And I think it's when parents hear those dreaded words, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do. Places like Emily's house say, yes, there is more we can do. We can add, like I said at the beginning, we may not be able to add days to your child's life, but we're certainly going to try to fill every day with as much life as possible. And when people come through our doors, they think, oh, it's a hospice, it's kind of dark, doom and gloom. There is so much light, so much activity. There is music, there's day camps that go on. I mean, it really is about celebrating every moment as much and in the way that the family wants to as well. Like we accommodate whatever way they want to do that. So yes, it can be sad, but somebody's got to be on this end of the life journey, right? As well.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that, and this is a question from a viewer, is there a role that churches can play in helping with palliative care? Because I would think churches would be the perfect kinds of communities to rally around this. Rauni, is there a way churches can help?
Absolutely. We work with several churches, and we've done everything from training some of their people so they can look after people in their own parish, and volunteer for them when they're actually facing a life-limiting illness. As well, we've recruited a lot of volunteers that come through the church and who end up being volunteers either at Emily's house or by visiting people in their own homes, or visiting people in long-term care facilities, or visiting people in the hospital. So it certainly does have a huge role, I believe, in being the hands and the feet and the face of Christ in a way that you don't preach it, you do it.
Okay, and what if you were in Brandon, Manitoba, to pick a city that a friend just moved to? How do you look up hospice in the, online? I was going to say in the yellow pages, and try to find a local place that you can be trained? Like, are there places across Canada to be involved with?
Yes, we have in Ontario, I believe we have about 75 visiting hospices, which is like Philip Aziz Centre, and we have close to 45 residential hospices now across the country as well. Hospice is on the radar, of course, and we talked about MAID. I think the other thing MAID has done is actually thrown a lot of light on hospice and the need to have access to palliative hospice care in light of as a choice. If it truly is a choice, you need to have as much offered in palliative care as everybody has access to MAID, but everybody doesn't have access to palliative care. So But I would say yes, they could look up hospice in their community because they are right across Canada, and find out ways that they can volunteer.
Okay.
I would
And
also,
go
I would
ahead,
also
Julia.
throw into that. I mean, the early church, like right from the very beginning, its biggest distinctive from Roman society was the fact that it chose to care for the sick and the dying, which is not a Roman value at all. And it was astounding to the Roman Empire.
Mm.
And so and people who were not necessarily part of the church, it was anybody living in the Roman Empire the church would take care of. And so I would also encourage people to think about who is their neighbor, right? Who
Mm.
are the people that live near them? Who are the people who live next door? And how do they help take care of those, especially as our population is aging?
Mm-hmm.
And how, knowing that I think now it's 29% of all Canadians are 65 and older. So even small things like how do we help shovel our neighbor's walk? How do we
Mm.
companion with the newly widowed gentleman, 2 doors down? Those things that we as the church, as the hands and feet, should just be doing with our regular lives. I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to have a specific hospice training, but it is about how do we care for our frail and elderly and our vulnerable, who are literally right next door to us.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just read a book about discipleship, and it was encouraging people to be ordinary Christians. And I really liked that. It was like, yeah, that's actually pretty straightforward. All those things you just described, Julia. So you are both women and leaders of faith. I wondered if I could ask you how your faith motivates your work and also sustains you as you do it. Rauni?
It sustains me. I would answer that first in the way that it is difficult work at times. You are dealing with death and dying. There is a lot of mystery surrounding suffering and death. There are no pat answers. I don't like pat answers because they really make no sense to somebody who's sick or dying or suffering. It gives me a place to make, though I can't make sense of it, a place where I can lay it down at the end of the day and know somehow God is in the midst of that mystery. I don't have to keep trying to figure it out, have it A equals B, but somehow I find rest in my faith, in the mystery, and in the face of death and suffering, and not having all the answers, and not having a magic wand that I can make pain go away and not see children die anymore or adults die anymore. As far as motivation, I would say, again, it gives me a place of strength and a place at the end of the day to say, you know what, I can't change these things, but I have the privilege, as Julia said, to come alongside of people at this very sacred time and to walk people home.
Yeah. Thank you. Julia?
I mean, I think, to be fair, like you'd mentioned, right? Death is still a tragedy. It is still a tragedy, and
Mhm.
it rips families apart. It breaks our hearts, and it is always sad for people. And I think in terms of my faith, I guess for me, like, but I know it's not the end, right? It's not
Mm.
the end. And even though we all have to shuffle off this mortal coil, right? Like, it there is still hope for me, and it is some of that. How do I bring light? How do I bring um, life to people? And how can we, by supporting people and giving them some of that, by just companioning with them, how do we share that, like, just not necessarily even by words, right? Like, that's not certainly not my job as a physician, but simply to be there, to love them in ways that perhaps they may never have encountered in their lives, or may not be, for whatever reasons, having access to even at the end of life. And how do we help people do that? And I think uh, that hope that I have, that this is not all that there is, that there is mystery, that there is beyond, that helps me work through that, right? And it helps encourage me as well when I do have patients who are of faith, that they know as well that they are going
Mm.
home, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And palliative care, the spirit of it happens sometimes and has happened without us calling it that, right? When families are surrounded by good care and people used to die at home all the time, and that was more normal back then, and now I guess we're so afraid of it. You have been in the trenches, so to speak. I guess, yeah, I'm wondering how it has changed your perception of death and how you think about preparing for your own end of life, not to be too heavy, but I guess I'm also asking, like, are there things we should be thinking about now with our families, even about how we want to die?
Well, I think I think it's hard in some ways, and it's also very easy. I mean, most people, if you ask them, most people would be like, "Oh yes, I would like to die at home in my sleep, not know that it happened," you know, and
Right.
of course, right? No one is like, "Oh yeah, my ideal way to die would be in a hospital with so many tubes and things attached to me. That's totally how I want to go." So, I mean, I think there are some things that are easy, things like having conversations. People from my cultural background, they don't like talking about death, right? And yet we all know it will eventually come for each of us, eventually. And so I think talking about death as part of life, a sad part of life, um, needs to happen. I think being open about that. I think some of the families that are usually the most prepared are usually the ones that have had these conversations with their loved ones over a long period of time, so that their spouse or their children or whoever are well aligned with where their loved one is at and what they want. It's also hard in terms of for people who aren't in the medical field. It is kind of hard to kind of prepare for every type of scenario. It's hard to know what you would want under situation A, B, or C, and that's true.
Yeah.
But I think having some principles around what would their desire be, and that's not also to discount kind of what is also realistic, because generations ago when people had 10 or 12 children, sharing that kind of workload was easier than it is now, where people are having fewer children who may not even live in the same province, let alone the same country. And so there are some real resource challenges of what is realistic for people as well. So,
Yeah. Rauni, would you like to jump in there?
I would just really agree with Julia. Advanced care planning is huge, and it really is important to have those conversations. It's easier on the family that's being left behind when they already know what your wishes are, what your desires are. That can be anywhere from do you want to be hooked up to life support to any of your requests. So those are really important, is to have those conversations.
Yeah.
funeral planning, like all of those
Yes,
things
exactly.
that help make the family's life easier after you're gone, right?
Yeah, exactly.
A viewer of the webinar earlier wrote in, that is a surprise that 89% could benefit from hospice, but only 15% get it in Canada. So we mentioned that earlier. I'd like to ask you both, as practitioners, what would be your wishes for palliative care in Canada in the next few years? Like, what would you love to see happen, and what could happen, do you think, Julia?
I think one of the big challenges, and I know this is not really about MAID, but some of the
And let's just clarify, just in case
sorry,
someone doesn't know.
medical assistance in dying,
Thanks.
it is that there's an increasing narrative around wanting control and wanting to choose when one dies, and not allowing, say, disease or disability or mental capacity to diminish, and choosing to leave before all of that's done. And I think it it'll be a challenge going into the future. I think it would be lovely if we, as a society, had better narratives around death, if we had better stories around death. I think a lot of this idea around medical assistance in dying, and the idea of control over time of death, is just a different manifestation of our deep, deep, deep fear of death. And so I think some of that needs to come into play. It would be really lovely if everyone who was eligible for palliative care could get palliative care. A lot of it is a systems issue, some of it's resource issue. Uh, some of it is also willingness for practitioners to go into it. It's a bit complicated beyond kind of just how to do it. I think we probably could. It's just there's a lot of system coordination and system factors that come into play.
Yeah. And what you said about fear being a motivation in the conversation about medical assisted dying actually helps me think more compassionately about that, I think. So that's a very good point to bring up, why someone would be so wanting that when there are other good options available to them. Rauni, how about you? What is your vision, your best vision for palliative care and hospice in Canada in the next few years?
It would be pretty similar to what Julia alluded to, and that would be that every person in Ontario that needs palliative hospice care, regardless of the setting, would actually have access to it. And that would mean everything from training doctors, more doctors in palliative care who are just going through to be general practitioners, but they actually, general physicians, that they would learn more about palliative care. It would be about nursing colleges, nurses learning more about palliative care, even if they're not particularly going into palliative care. I think it's an opportunity. I'd like to see more of the church engaged. This is an incredible opportunity for the church to stand up and support life lived fully to the end, and to see more resources, which keeps coming up. And we know that it's more cost effective. For example, we don't want to really give a business case as to why you should get hospice care. But the reality is, receiving care in a residential bed, not only is it more humane and comfortable, but it's about a third of the price of getting that same type of care in a hospital setting. Mm-hmm. So putting more resources into visiting hospice, into residential hospice, and just education and awareness so that people, when they need it, will have access. And again, everybody may not choose it, but at least they would have an access point, hear about it, and make the choice themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would like in our last few minutes to go like super practical. You are both women who are obviously very comfortable with people who are dying, and you have had lots of practice helping people and families in those last weeks or days or minutes of life. And so I think sometimes why we don't get involved is because we're afraid. I know I've been afraid to go see a dying friend because I'm afraid I'm going to say something, ridiculous or whatever. So I'd love to hear, starting with you, Rauni, your practical tips, literally, for helping someone and family friends who are in that situation. How can we help well?
I always come to that with the answer of presence and how important presence is. People aren't going to have to try to remember what you said. They're going to remember that you were there. Okay. And you're right. Often we may not have the right words, or sometimes we pull pat answers out of a hat, which when we do that, we actually shut the person down from expressing how they're feeling. But being present, allowing your friend or the family member to truly talk about it instead of, no, it'll be okay. You know what? It's not going to be okay. Mm-hmm. And so allowing them really to talk it through with you and being present there for them and seeing things that they might need. Not always saying, what is it I can do for you? Because the person may not be able to identify that. But you may see that, hey, they might need some food. Or you might be able to say, hey, Thursday night, why don't you go out and get your hair done? I'm going to come here and hang out with John. Okay. Just looking for practical things like that you can help with.
Yeah. And when you
and not being afraid. Sorry. We said about what to say.
It's okay to be scared.
It's okay to be scared. Yeah. And just to be present. You're not going to mess up. I mean, your friend is going to remember, the family member is going to remember that, my gosh, she still comes and visits me every Thursday.
Yeah. And Julia, how about you? How can we learn from a physician who has done palliative care?
I think there was one patient that I had who was very involved with his church as he was dying. And my gosh, like the number of casseroles, food is very important. And kind of just people who would relieve family members. Partly also, I have to say, it's also because he was willing to have them there, which is not the case for everyone. But the number of people and the busyness around him in terms of his community coming around him and providing care, not just for him, but for his family caregivers, even doing the hard stuff like doing the overnight shift and doing all those kinds of things. And, his pastor coming once a week to visit, the prayer team coming, and it was possibly the most busy home that I had been at, because the community was around and was, and even when he got transferred to hospice, they still kept on coming. And so when he died, he knew that his community cared for him deeply and they loved him unto death.
Wow.
And so he died. It was bittersweet, right? Because he was sad that he had to leave them, but it was also good because he knew he was loved, right? So, and that I would say was probably the most powerful witness of what the church did, because even at the hospice, the staff noticed that this particular man had a bazillion people and singing and music and praying and and all that, compared to most other patients who barely had, just a small handful of immediate family. But he allowed for his whole family, his whole church family, to be involved with him. Right?
Oh, that's beautiful. That to go that way, right?
Yeah.
That sounds really, really great. And I'm sure also comforting if this man had family, it would be so much more comforting for his family and just practically helpful too. So if somebody watching today is from a church and they think their church should, get moving, or an individual, what should they do? Just a straight old Google to see who is nearby in terms of palliative and hospice organizations?
I would say almost first, who is in your communion of saints, right? Who are the elderly people in your church family, and how do you care for them, right? First of all, and are there people who, because of disability or illness, have not been able to attend, or have been, for their own health sakes, been transferred to, say, a long-term care facility or something, that they can't participate in the life of the community anymore? And how can your church take care of them and look out for them, right? I think is a very first and practical way of doing so. It's not just the pastor's job to go and visit them, right? It is the church's responsibility. I'd say that's probably a very first easy step, is kind of look at how well are you caring for your own, and before you kind of start figuring out how to take care of people outside. Because if you're already doing a pretty bang up job of taking care of your elderly, then that's kind of when you go further. But I think if looking at your own church and figuring out, well, how are we caring for our vulnerable in our own midst?
That's a very good challenge, Julia. Rauni, what would you add to that? Or
I absolutely agree. And because I am a huge proponent of hospice, I would say look up your local hospice, see ways that you can get involved, because there's a lot of people who are unchurched. There's a lot of people who are alienated. There's a lot of people who are alone. A lot of people never enter the doorstep of a church. And you as a church can go into those homes and meet some of the needs and be the compassionate presence of Christ into those lives. And from experience, like I said, our volunteers that come here, they stay with us for a very long time, and they would have stories upon stories of incredible experience that they've had when they've gone into a stranger's home and made that stranger their neighbor and the person whom they have shared life and love with by just showing up week after week, week after week.
Yeah, there is clearly. I love the idea of it being a presence. I think I think it was you, Rauni, who said that. It's sort of a ministry of presence, and clearly that is such an important part of it. So, thank you both so much for being willing to give us your time today and your expertise and your inspiration. And I guess I would ask you if just for one sort of final statement about palliative care. I mean, I think you've kind of done that already, but encourage those of us who are still nervous. Rauni, do you want to go first?
One final word about palliative care. I go back to what I said at the very beginning. There are people there when we are born that celebrate us. And in the same way, there's an incredible privilege and needs to happen to people who are dying, that there are people there as well on that side. Both are sacred passages of life, birth and death, and we need to have somebody at each end.
Beautiful. Thank you. Julia?
Yeah, I would also say the same thing. It is a travesty when someone dies alone,
Yeah.
and no one should have to die alone.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think that is a rallying cry for the church to see how can they truly love their neighbors unto death.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today for this webinar. We want to remind you that the EFC does create resources for Canadian churches, and we have just released the Palliative Care Toolkit. It's a practical guide to support life during serious illness or at life's end. And we already know of at least one church who ordered 40 copies and are using it as a discussion group and a Bible study. And that's kind of the vision for it. So we encourage you to find that online on our website, and you'll be also able to find this webinar as well as all our other ones at the efc.ca/webinar. So thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.